Eve Smith had exactly 90 seconds before her captors realized she was more valuable alive than dead, and she intended to use every one of them. The armored SUV idled at the intersection of 5th and Baroque, caught in the snarl of midday traffic. Through the dirty window she could barely make out the street, but what she saw made her breath catch. A man emerged from the marble steps of the Regent Hotel, and even through the grimy glass, his presence was undeniable. Enzo Castelli moved like a knife through water, sleek dark suit tailored to perfection, his loosened collar revealing ink that climbed his throat like vines reclaiming ancient ruins. But it wasn't the man who made Eve's heart slam against her ribs. It was the beast beside him, Ares. A brick wall of a pit bull, all muscle and bronze fur, prowled at Enzo's heel with the focused intensity of a trained killer. The dog's eyes swept the street with mechanical precision, cataloging threats, assessing angles. Eve had maybe 3 seconds before the light changed. Her fingers, still bound with zip ties, fumbled with the torn piece of gallery canvas she'd ripped from her bag during the struggle. Using the edge of her silver bracelet, a gift from her brother, before he disappeared into witness protection, she scratched 2 words in desperate jagged letters: "Kidnapped help." She pressed it against the window, angling it low. Not toward the man in the $10,000 suit, toward the dog whose intelligence radiated like heat. Ares stopped walking. His massive head swiveled. Those amber eyes locked onto the sign, then onto Eve's face. For one impossible moment, woman and animal shared a understanding that bypassed language entirely. Eve mouthed 2 words: "Please. Help." The pit bull's entire body went rigid. A sound emerged from his chest, low, primal, dangerous, that cut through the city's white noise like a blade. Enzo's hand tightened on the leash, his attention snapping from his phone to his dog to the SUV in one fluid motion. Then Ares did something Eve would never forget. "Stay with us, because what this pit bull does next will leave you speechless. Before we start, make sure to hit like and subscribe. And really, I'm curious. Where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel." The dog lunged with such explosive force that the custom leather leash snapped like thread. He didn't bark, he didn't hesitate. He became a bronze missile aimed directly at the SUV's front tire, jaws open, purpose absolute. The collision of fang and rubber created a sound that made pedestrians scatter. Eve was thrown sideways as the SUV lurched violently, the driver screaming obscenities in Russian. The vehicle mounted the curb, sideswiped a newspaper stand, and came to a grinding halt against a fire hydrant. Water exploded upward in a glittering column. Through the cracked window, Eve watched Enzo Castelli approach. He moved with the unhurried confidence of a man who knew the city's pulse bent to his rhythm. His aviators reflected the chaos, his expression carved from marble. Behind him, Ares maintained a defensive stance over the shredded tire, growling a warning that needed no translation. The driver's door flew open. Dmitri, one of Viktor Petrov's most brutal enforcers, stumbled out, reaching for his concealed weapon. He never cleared leather. Enzo's movement was economical, brutal, final. One moment Dmitri was upright, the next he was face down on the wet pavement, arm twisted at an angle that made Eve's stomach turn. The second enforcer tried to exit through the rear, but Ares was already there, teeth bared, blocking any escape. Then Enzo's eyes found Eve through the broken window. They were the coldest thing she'd ever seen. Dark, assessing, devoid of mercy. He studied her the way a jeweler studies a stone, calculating value, authenticity, usefulness. "Out," he said simply. Eve's hands shook as she fumbled with the door handle. Her legs nearly gave out when she stood, but she forced herself upright, meeting his gaze with as much defiance as she could summon. "Thank you," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "Your dog has excellent taste in rescue operations." One dark eyebrow arched above his sunglasses. "My dog," Enzo said slowly, "has never broken his leash, ever. He tilted his head, his attention shifting to Ares, who had moved to sit beside Eve, pressed against her leg like a guardian. Interesting. A groan from Dimitri drew Enzo's attention. He crouched beside the enforcer with predatory grace, retrieved a phone from the man's pocket, and scrolled through it with casual efficiency. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. When he stood, something had changed in his expression. A calculation made. A decision reached. "Eve Smith," he said, and her blood turned to ice. How did he know her name? 24 years old. Artist. Sister of Marcus Smith, currently residing in a very secure, very secret location under Castelli family protection. He pocketed the phone. The Petrovs didn't kidnap you randomly. They knew exactly who you were. Eve's defiance cracked. "My brother is fine. For now." Enzo's tone was clinical. "But you just became the most valuable piece on a chessboard you didn't know you were playing on." He glanced at the gathering crowd, the distant wail of sirens. "We have approximately 90 seconds before this intersection becomes very complicated. You have a choice. Come with me and live, or stay here and see how long you survive when the Petrovs realize their operation just became front-page news." "That's not a choice," Eve said. "No," Enzo agreed, something almost resembling respect flickering across his features. "It isn't." Ares pressed closer to Eve, his warmth solid and reassuring. 3 black SUVs rounded the corner, moving with purpose. Enzo held out his hand, palm up an invitation or a command. Eve couldn't tell which. She took it. His grip was firm, warm, absolute. He pulled her toward a sleek black car that materialized as if summoned, Ares flowing beside them like a bronze shadow. As they moved, Eve caught sight of herself in a storefront window, bedraggled, terrified, but somehow still standing. "Your dog saved my life," she said as Enzo opened the door. He paused, something unreadable crossing his face as he looked at Ares, then at her. "No," he said quietly. "You saved your own life. You just knew who to ask for help." His eyes met hers, and for the first time she saw something beyond the cold calculation. "That makes you either very smart or very dangerous. I intend to find out which." The door closed, the engine purred, and as the city blurred past the tinted windows, Eve realized that being kidnapped by the Petrovs was just the beginning. The real danger was sitting beside her, smelling of expensive cologne and controlled violence, with a dog who apparently had just rewritten both their fates. The safe house wasn't what Eve expected, no shadowy warehouse or abandoned building, instead, a penthouse apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's glittering skyline. Enzo moved through the space with the ease of familiarity, his phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Italian that sounded like silk wrapped around steel. Ares hadn't left Eve's side since the car, his warm presence anchored at her feet like a living security system. Eve stood by the window, watching the city sprawl below a city that suddenly felt foreign, dangerous, full of invisible threats. Her reflection stared back, disheveled hair, torn jacket, the faint bruise on her jaw darkening to purple. She looked like someone who'd survived something. She felt like someone waiting for the other shoe to drop. Behind her, Enzo ended his call with a clipped word that needed no translation. "Sit," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Eve turned slowly, raising an eyebrow. "I'm not one of your soldiers." "No," Enzo agreed, moving closer with predatory grace. "You're something far more complicated." He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that Eve could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, the tension coiled in his shoulders. "Which brings me to my question. What the hell were you thinking, signaling my dog?" "I was thinking," Eve said, meeting his gaze without flinching, "that I was about to be trafficked or killed or both, and I needed help. Your dog looked smarter than half the people on that street." "My dog," Enzo's voice dropped dangerously low, "is trained to ignore distractions, trained to respond only to my commands. Yet he broke his leash, something he has never done for a complete stranger. Maybe he has better instincts than his owner." The words hung in the air between them, electric and defiant. Enzo's jaw tightened. For a moment, something flickered across his face: surprise, irritation, the ghost of amusement. "You have no idea who you're speaking to." Enzo Castelli, 33 years old, head of the Castelli crime family. Ruthless, calculating, and apparently very attached to his dog. Eve crossed her arms, channeling every ounce of courage she had left. "Did I miss anything?" "Yes," Enzo said quietly, stepping closer until the air itself seemed charged. "The part where I decide whether you're an asset or a liability." Before Eve could respond, a groan echoed from the adjacent room. The two Petrov enforcers, Sergei and his companion, were zip-tied to reinforced chairs, blood crusting their faces from Enzo's efficient takedown. Enzo moved toward them with the calm focus of a surgeon approaching an operating table. "Eve," he said without looking back, "stay there. And close your eyes if you have a weak stomach." "I'm an artist," Eve called after him. "I've seen plenty of blood. Not like this." She followed anyway, Ares padding silently beside her. In the stark room, Enzo crouched before Sergei, his presence radiating controlled menace. "You have one chance," Enzo said in accented English, his tone conversational. "Tell me who ordered the hit, why they took the girl, and what they plan to do with her." Sergei spat blood onto the floor. "Go to hell." Enzo's expression didn't change. He simply stood, removed his suit jacket with careful precision, and rolled up his sleeves. The tattoos on his forearms were intricate saints and sinners, prayers written in ink and pain. What happened next was clinical, brutal, terrifyingly effective. Enzo didn't shout, didn't threaten. He simply applied pressure to specific points until Sergei's defiance crumbled into screaming cooperation. Eve forced herself to watch, to understand the man whose dog had saved her life. "The girl," Sergei finally gasped. "Victor wants the girl because she's Marcus Smith's sister. The witness you're protecting, he'll trade himself for her. Victor's plan: make the exchange, kill them both." The room went silent. Enzo straightened slowly, his eyes cutting to Eve with laser focus. "Marcus Smith." Eve's stomach dropped. "That's my brother. I know exactly who your brother is." Enzo's voice was ice. "He's been in my protective custody for 3 months, preparing to testify against the Volkov syndicate. He's the linchpin witness that will dismantle half the Russian operations in this city." He moved toward her, each step deliberate. "And you're telling me the Petrovs knew you were his sister?" "I didn't tell anyone," Eve protested. Her mind racing. "Marcus and we haven't spoken in months. He went into hiding, and I thought he was just being paranoid." "He was being smart," Enzo interrupted. "Unlike you, apparently, who continued living your normal life, working at cafes, displaying art in public galleries, making yourself a perfect target." The accusation stung because it was true. "You're going to tell me everything," Enzo said, his voice brooking no argument. "Every conversation you had in the past 6 months, everyone who asked about Marcus, A phone buzzed. Sergei's phone. Lying on the nearby table. Enzo snatched it up, his expression darkening as he read the screen. "They know. The Petrovs know their team failed." As if summoned by the words, glass exploded inward. The window shattered in a spray of crystalline shards. Eve hit the floor on instinct, Ares covering her body with his own. Above her, Enzo moved like controlled chaos weapon drawn, returning fire with surgical precision. "How many?" Eve shouted over the gunfire. "Too many," Enzo called back, ejecting a spent magazine and slamming home a fresh one. They sent a full tactical team. More windows shattered. Bullets tore through expensive furniture, shredded artwork, punched holes in walls. Enzo dropped 2 shooters, then 3, but more kept coming, professionals rappelling down from the roof, breaching through the service entrance. "We need to move," Enzo growled, grabbing Eve's arm and hauling her toward a hidden door she hadn't noticed. "Now, what about—" "They're already dead," Enzo said flatly, referencing the captured enforcers. "Focus on staying alive." They burst into a service corridor, Ares leading point. Behind them, the sound of tactical boots echoed heavy, rhythmic, inevitable. Enzo pulled Eve against the wall, his body shielding hers, his breath warm against her ear. Listen, carefully. You are not some random kidnapping victim anymore. You're Marcus Smith's sister, which makes you the single most valuable piece of leverage in this city. The Petrovs will burn everything to get you. And now that I have you, I have to protect you to protect my own operation. So what does that make me? Eve asked, hating how her voice trembled. Enzo's dark eyes met hers, and for a moment, she saw past the crime lord to the man beneath, exhausted, burdened, but unbending. You're not gonna be bait, he said firmly, his hand tightening on her arm. You're going to be leverage. The first tactical team rounded the corner, weapons raised. Move! Enzo commanded, pulling Eve into a run. Behind them, the first shots rang out sharp, violent, echoing through the corridor like thunderclaps. And Eve Smith, artist and sister and unexpected catalyst, ran beside a mafia boss and his loyal dog, her quiet life burning to ash behind her with every bullet that tore through the air. The service exit spilled them into the chaos of the Mercado district, a labyrinth of vendor stalls, food carts, and afternoon crowds that pressed together like a living organism. The air smelled of grilled meat, expensive perfume, and urban desperation. Perfect cover, or perfect trap. Enzo moved through the crowd like a shark through water fluid, purposeful, lethal. His hand remained locked around Eve's wrist, pulling her through gaps that seemed to appear and vanish in heartbeats. Ares flowed beside them, his bronze coat attracting admiring glances that had no idea they were watching a weapon in motion. Eve stumbled over uneven cobblestones, her artist's boots never designed for tactical retreats. A fruit vendor shouted as Enzo shoved past his display, sending oranges rolling like small suns across the pavement. "Can't we slow down?" Eve gasped, her lungs burning. "No," Enzo said simply, yanking her around a corner just as bullets stitched across the brick wall behind them. Plaster exploded, screams erupted, the crowd scattered like startled birds. Behind them, the Petrov tactical team moved with military efficiency, black tactical gear, silenced weapons, coordinated hand signals. They didn't care about witnesses. They cared about results. "Left," Enzo commanded, pulling Eve into a narrow alley between a butcher shop and a vintage clothing store. The passage reeked of rotting meat and stale water, barely wide enough for them to move single file. A shadow moved at the alley's far end. Enzo stopped so abruptly that Eve slammed into his back. He was solid, immovable, his body radiating tension. Slowly, he released her wrist and reached for his concealed weapon. "Stay behind me," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "When I move, you run straight through. Don't stop, don't look back." "What about you?" "I'll be fine. I always am." Before Eve could argue, Enzo exploded into motion. 3 shots, surgically precise. The shadow at the alley's end dropped, but 2 more appeared behind them, cutting off their retreat. They were trapped. The assassins, twins, Eve noticed with detached horror, identical faces carved from Slavic stone advanced with weapons raised. One spoke into a radio, rapid Russian that sounded like a death sentence. Enzo calculated angles, distances, probabilities. His weapon had 4 rounds left, 2 targets. The math was tight, brutal, possible. Then Eve stepped forward. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling but clear. She addressed the twins in English, praying they understood. "The boss is furious." Both assassins paused, confusion flickering across their identical faces. Eve forced herself to continue, channeling every ounce of terrified sincerity she possessed. Victor said, "If you fail, if you let her escape again, I'm the one who gets to watch you be fed to the piranhas." She gestured to herself with shaking hands. "Me, personally." He said I'd earned it. Silence stretched like pulled wire. The twins exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their military precision. One lowered his weapon fractionally, suspicious but hesitant. "You work for Victor? Do I look like I'm here by choice?" Eve snapped, letting genuine fear fuel her anger. "I was supposed to be interrogating her in a nice clean room, Not running through garbage alleys because you idiots lost her the first time. The second twin's radio crackled with Russian demands. It bought them 3 seconds. Enzo moved. The first twin never saw the strike coming, a blur of controlled violence that sent the man crashing into rusted dumpsters. The second managed to raise his weapon, but Ares was already airborne, jaws clamping onto the man's forearm with bone-crushing force. 30 seconds later, both assassins were unconscious, disarmed, and zip-tied with their own restraints. Enzo stood over them, breathing steady despite the violence, his dark eyes finding Eve's. For a moment, something flickered across his expression: surprise, calculation, and something that might have been admiration. "Piranhas?" he said quietly. I panicked. Eve managed, her hands still shaking. It was the first threatening thing I could think of. It was brilliant. Enzo moved closer, close enough that Eve could see the faint sheen of sweat on his brow, the intensity burning behind his controlled facade. Terrifying, but brilliant. "You bought me exactly what I needed." Which was doubt, hesitation. 3 seconds. His lips quirked into something almost resembling a smile. "That's all it takes." Their eyes held for a beat too long. Ares nudged between them, breaking the moment with canine practicality. "We need to move," Enzo said, his voice rougher than before. "The rest of the team will converge on this location within minutes." They emerged from the alley into a different section of the market, upscale boutiques giving way to industrial spaces. Enzo led them through a series of seemingly random turns that Eve suspected were anything but, finally stopping before an unremarkable door set between a closed tattoo parlor and an artisan bakery. He produced a key from somewhere Eve couldn't see, unlocking 3 separate mechanisms with practiced efficiency. The interior was jarring, industrial chic, meeting unexpected luxury. Exposed brick walls, leather furniture that probably cost more than Eve's yearly rent, a kitchen with appliances that gleamed like surgical instruments. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city's warehouse district, the glass clearly reinforced, probably bulletproof. Enzo locked the door behind them, 1 deadbolt, 2, 3, then activated a security system with a code Eve couldn't follow. "We're safe here," he said, shrugging out of his jacket. His shirt underneath was torn, revealing the edge of his tattoos and a fresh bruise already forming on his ribs. "For now." Eve sank onto the leather couch, her legs finally giving out. Adrenaline drained from her system, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Ares immediately jumped up beside her, resting his massive head on her lap like they'd known each other for years. "Does he always do this?" Eve asked, running her fingers through the pit bull's short fur. "Never," Enzo said, his voice carrying an edge of something Eve couldn't identify. He moved to the kitchen, retrieving a bottle of expensive-looking whiskey and 2 glasses. "Ares doesn't trust strangers. He barely tolerates my own men. Maybe he recognizes a fellow survivor." Enzo poured 2 generous measures, crossing to hand Eve 1 glass. His fingers brushed hers during the exchange, warm, calloused, surprisingly gentle. "To survival," he said quietly, raising his glass. Eve clinked hers against his. "To dogs with better instincts than their owners." That earned her a genuine smile, brief, unexpected, transforming his face from dangerous to devastating. They drank in silence, the whiskey burning pleasantly down Eve's throat. Enzo settled into the chair opposite her, his dark eyes never leaving her face. The intensity of his gaze made her skin prickle with awareness. Not fear exactly, but recognition of something shifting between them. "That performance in the alley," Enzo said finally, swirling his whiskey with practiced ease. "Where did you learn to lie like that?" "I didn't lie," Eve countered, feeling boldness fueled by whiskey and surviving. "I just improvised. Artists are good at that." "Artists," Enzo repeated, something unreadable in his tone. "You paint?" "Mostly portraits, some abstract work." Eve gestured vaguely with her glass. "Nothing that prepares you for being kidnapped by Russian mobsters." "No," Enzo agreed, his lips quirking. "That's fairly specialized training." Outside, the city hummed with evening traffic, oblivious to the violence that had erupted in its streets. Inside the safe house, tension coiled between them, danger and attraction wound so tightly Eve couldn't distinguish where one ended and the other began. Enzo stood, moving to secure the windows, check the exits, maintain the careful vigilance that kept him alive. But his eyes kept returning to Eve, lingering a fraction too long, carrying questions neither of them was ready to voice. "Get some rest," he finally said, his voice rougher than necessary. "We have a long night ahead." But as Eve closed her eyes, Ares warm against her side, she felt Enzo's gaze like a physical touch, protective, possessive, dangerous, and infinitely, impossibly compelling. Eve woke to the smell of espresso and the weight of Enzo's scrutiny. He sat across from her in the pre-dawn darkness, perfectly still, a barely touched cup steaming on the table beside him. How long had he been watching her? The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it sparked something else entirely, awareness that prickled along her skin like electricity. "We need to talk," Enzo said, his voice stripped of the warmth from hours before. Eve sat up, dislodging Ares, who grumbled but relocated to the floor. Through the reinforced windows, the city was still caught between night and morning, streetlights competing with the first hints of dawn. "What time is it?" 4:30. Enzo leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his dark eyes intense. "I need you to tell me everything about your brother. Every conversation, every contact, everyone who knew about your relationship with Marcus." The interrogation had begun. Eve wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the apartment's warmth. "Marcus and I haven't spoken in 4 months, not since he called me at 2 a.m., terrified, saying he'd witnessed something he couldn't unsee and needed to disappear." "What exactly did he witness?" "He never told me specifics, just that it involved the Volkov syndicate, money laundering, and people who'd kill to keep it quiet." Eve's voice cracked. "He said the less I knew, the safer I'd be." "Guess that theory didn't work out." Enzo's expression remained unreadable. "Who else knew Marcus was your brother? Everyone? It's not a secret, we have the same last name, we grew up in the same neighborhood. I mean, recently," Enzo interrupted, his tone sharpening. "Who have you told in the past 6 months?" Eve thought back, her mind foggy with exhaustion and fear. "My gallery owner, Elena. A few friends from art school. My landlord, maybe? I don't know, Enzo, it's not exactly classified information." "It should have been." He stood, pacing the length of the room with predatory restlessness. "The Petrovs targeted you specifically. They knew who you were, where you'd be, exactly when to strike. That level of intelligence requires either extensive surveillance or someone told them," Eve finished quietly. "Yes." The word hung between them, heavy with accusation. Eve's restlessness finally overcame her exhaustion. She stood, moving to the windows, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Outside, the city was waking up delivery trucks, early commuters, a world that continued spinning despite the chaos consuming her life. "I can't just sit here," she said, her voice tight. "I need to move, to do something, to what? Paint your feelings?" Enzo's tone was harsh, but when Eve turned to glare at him, she caught something softer beneath the sarcasm. Concern, maybe, or exhaustion that mirrored her own. "Actually, yes." Eve spotted her bag, the one she'd been carrying when the Petrovs took her sitting on the kitchen counter. Someone, probably Enzo, had retrieved it from the wreckage. She grabbed it, pulling out her small sketchbook and a worn pencil. Enzo watched her with visible skepticism. "You're going to draw? Now? It helps me think." Eve settled back onto the couch, flipping to a clean page. Her hand moved almost involuntarily, muscle memory taking over. "You interrogate people. I sketch them." For several minutes, the only sound was pencil on paper and Enzo's measured breathing as he continued his restless patrol of the apartment. Eve's sketch took shape, Ares in perfect profile, every muscle captured, his intelligent eyes rendered with careful attention to the alertness that never quite faded. She added shadows, texture, the weight of his presence. When she looked up, Enzo had stopped pacing. He stood behind the couch, close enough that she could feel his body heat, staring at her drawing with an expression she couldn't decipher. "He's beautiful, isn't he?" Eve said softly. "He's a weapon," Enzo corrected, but his voice lacked conviction. He rounded the couch, sitting beside her closer than necessary, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "But yes, beautiful too." For a moment, the interrogation facade cracked. Eve saw exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the weight of responsibility in the set of his shoulders. This wasn't just a crime lord protecting an asset. This was a man trying to keep everyone alive, including himself. "Marcus was always the brave one," Eve said quietly, returning to her sketch. "I was the quiet sister, the one who hid in art studios and avoided confrontation. When he told me he was going to testify, I begged him not to, told him to run, to disappear somewhere far away." Her pencil stilled. "He said some things are worth dying for. I called him an idiot." "He was right," Enzo said, his voice gentler than she'd heard it. "And you were right. Both things can be true." Eve looked at him, really looked, and saw past the tailored menace to something more complicated. A man who'd chosen this life or been born into it, she couldn't tell which, but a man who understood the cost of protection, the weight of loyalty. "Why do you care?" she asked. "About Marcus? About me? We're just leverage to you." Enzo held her gaze, something unguarded flickering across his features. "At first, maybe, but my dog chose you. Ares hasn't been wrong about someone in 8 years. That makes you—" He stopped abruptly, his attention snapping to Eve's neck. "What?" Eve touched her throat self-consciously. "That necklace." Enzo's voice had gone cold again. "Dangerous. Where did you get it?" Eve's fingers found the delicate chain she always wore, a small silver charm shaped like a paintbrush, a gift she treasured. "Marcus gave it to me. Right before he disappeared," he said. Her voice caught. "He said it was to remember him by, in case something happened." Enzo stood with lethal speed, pulling Eve to her feet. "Take it off. Now." "What? Why?" "Take it off." The command was absolute. With shaking hands, Eve unclasped the necklace. Enzo snatched it from her palm, holding it up to the dim light. His jaw tightened, every muscle in his body radiating fury barely contained. He carried the necklace to the kitchen, retrieving a knife from a drawer. With surgical precision, he pried apart the small paintbrush charm. Something fell onto the counter with a metallic clink. A tiny electronic device, no bigger than a grain of rice, gleaming with malevolent purpose. Eve's world tilted. "No. That's not Marcus wouldn't." "Marcus didn't," Enzo said, his voice like gravel. He picked up the device with gloved hands, examining it with the expertise of someone who'd seen too many. "This is military-grade tracking technology. Surgical implantation, long-range capability, probably activated remotely." His dark eyes found hers, and in them, Eve saw fury and something worse, pity. "Someone close to your brother planted this. Someone who knew he'd give you something meaningful before disappearing." The betrayal hit like a physical blow. Eve's legs gave out, she caught herself against the counter. "They've been tracking me this whole time? Every gallery, every cafe, every safe house I brought you to." Enzo finished grimly. He turned, hurling the necklace against the wall with explosive force. It shattered, pieces scattering like stars across expensive hardwood. Ares was on his feet, alert to his master's fury. "The Petrovs don't just want the witness," Enzo growled, his accent thickening with rage. "They have someone inside Marcus's protective detail, someone who had access to him, to his personal effects, to his plans." He stalked toward Eve, gripping her shoulders with barely controlled intensity. "Which means they know everything. Every safe house, every extraction route, every contingency plan." Eve's voice came out barely a whisper. "We're not safe anywhere." "No," Enzo agreed, his face inches from hers, his breath warm against her skin. "We're not. Outside? The first true light of dawn broke across the city skyline, illuminating the wreckage of Eve's shattered necklace and the dangerous intimacy of their proximity. And in that moment, surrounded by betrayal and tracking devices and the weight of impossible odds, Eve understood. Her brother's enemies had turned her into a weapon against everyone she touched, including the one man trying to keep her alive. The shattered necklace remained on the floor like evidence at a crime scene. Eve stared at the scattered pieces, her mind cycling through memories now tainted with suspicion. Every moment Marcus had seemed paranoid suddenly made terrible sense. Enzo was already moving, phone pressed to his ear, speaking rapid Italian interspersed with names Eve didn't recognize. His fury had transformed into something colder, more focused, the difference between fire and ice, both capable of destruction. He ended the call with a sharp word, then turned to Eve. "Get dressed. We have 30 minutes before my people arrive." "Your people?" "My lieutenants. The only men I trust with my life." His eyes held hers, dark and uncompromising. "And now with yours." 28 minutes later, Eve stood in Enzo's bedroom because, of course, this safe house was his personal space, wearing borrowed clothes that fit surprisingly well. Black jeans, a dark sweater, boots designed for movement rather than fashion. She barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman, staring back, looked capable. Dangerous, even. Voices echoed from the main room, deep, male, speaking Italian with the casual authority of men accustomed to violence. Eve took a breath and stepped out. 4 men occupied the space, each one a study in controlled menace. They stopped talking the moment she appeared, their collective attention focused and assessing. "Gentlemen," Enzo said in English, a courtesy Eve appreciated. "This is Eve Smith, Marcus Smith's sister. The reason the Petrovs just declared open season on our operations." The tallest one, silver-haired despite appearing only 40, with a scar bisecting his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "Dante Marchesi, Enzo's consigliere." His handshake was firm, professional, his eyes cataloging her like inventory. "The tracker situation is problematic. That's one word for it," Eve muttered. A younger man, maybe late 20s, with the kind of pretty boy features that probably concealed significant danger, grinned. "Luca Rossi. I handle tech and surveillance." He held up a small device similar to the one from her necklace. "Military grade, probably Israeli manufacture. Expensive. Whoever planted this had serious resources." The other 2 introduced themselves. Marco, built like a tank and in charge of physical security, and Alessio, quieter, with the focused eyes of a sniper. Enzo spread a map across the dining table, not a street map, but something more detailed, showing buildings, underground tunnels, security camera placements throughout the city's financial district. "The tracker is our advantage now," Enzo said, his finger tracing routes on the map. "The Petrovs think they know where Eve is. We use that. Feed them false information, draw them into a controlled environment." "And the mole?" Dante asked, his voice carrying decades of strategic thinking. "We flush them out." Enzo's smile was predatory. "Eve is bait. But this time, we control the trap." Eve's stomach tightened. "I thought I wasn't supposed to be bait." "You're not." Enzo's eyes met hers, and something passed between them. Trust, maybe, or the beginning of it. "You're the hunter pretending to be prey. There's a difference." For the next hour, they planned. Luca explained how he'd create a false signal using the tracker's signature, leading the Petrovs to an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district Castelli territory, controlled, surveilled. Marco detailed exit strategies, defensive positions, contingency plans for when things inevitably went wrong. Through it all, Ares remained pressed against Eve's leg, his warmth grounding her in the tactical chaos. Dante noticed. "The dog never leaves your side." "I've noticed," Eve said quietly. "Ares doesn't trust easily." The consigliere continued, his tone thoughtful. "In 8 years he's accepted exactly one person besides Enzo." He glanced at his boss. "Make of that what you will." Enzo's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The lieutenants eventually left to prepare, leaving Eve and Enzo alone with maps, weapons, and unspoken tension thick enough to choke on. Eve moved to the windows, watching the city pulse with afternoon life, normal people living normal lives, unaware of the chess game being played in the shadows. "Why do you do this?" she asked without turning. "The violence, the constant danger, the weight of keeping everyone alive. Why not just walk away?" Silence stretched behind her. Then footsteps, measured and deliberate. Enzo stopped beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "You think I chose this? Didn't you? My father built this empire on blood and strategy. When I was 23, a rival family decided to eliminate the Castelli line. They killed my father in front of me, my uncle, my 2 older brothers." His voice was stripped of emotion, clinical. "I survived because Ares, barely a year old, then attacked the shooter, gave me 3 seconds. Eve turned to look at him. In profile, backlit by afternoon sun, he looked carved from stone and shadows. 3 seconds, Enzo continued softly. "That's all it takes to lose everything or save it. I took over because the alternative was extinction. For my family, for everyone under our protection, for the balance that keeps this city from devolving into complete chaos. That's quite a burden. It's the only one I've got." He finally looked at her, and the weight in his eyes stole her breath. "Ares is my most loyal confidant because he's the only one who doesn't want something from me. He doesn't care about power or money or legacy, he just—" Enzo's voice roughed. "He just stays." Eve understood then. The dog wasn't a weapon or a status symbol. He was proof that loyalty could exist without agenda, that trust didn't always come with strings attached. "I'm sorry," she said. "About your family." "Don't be. They knew the life they chose." Enzo's hand came up, almost touching her face before he caught himself, lowering it. "But you didn't choose this. You're collateral damage in a war you didn't start." "Neither did you, technically." "No," he agreed, something like a smile ghosting his lips, "but I'm very good at finishing them." Ares chose that moment to wedge himself between them, resting his massive head on Eve's foot with a contented sigh. Enzo stared at his dog with visible confusion. "He's never done this. Any of this. Maybe he knows I need him," Eve suggested, running her fingers through Ares's fur. "Or maybe he's just tired of your emotional constipation and decided someone needed to model healthy attachment." That earned her a genuine laugh, brief, surprised, transforming Enzo's face into something almost boyish. The moment broke when Enzo's phone buzzed. He read the message, his expression hardening back into strategic focus. "Luca's ready. The false signal goes live in 2 hours." He turned to face Eve fully, his dark eyes intense. "This is your last chance to walk away. I can put you on a plane to anywhere in the world. New identity, clean start, protection until the Petrovs are eliminated. And Marcus? I'll handle it." Eve shook her head. "He's my brother. I'm not running while he's in danger." "Eve. Besides," she interrupted, channeling the defiance that had kept her alive this long, "I know things about Marcus. His habits, his tells, how he thinks when he's scared. Your mole knows tactics and security, but they don't know him. Not like I do." Enzo studied her for a long moment, calculation warring with something else in his expression. Finally, he moved to a locked cabinet, retrieving a small device, a communication earpiece, practically invisible. He held it out to her. "You do exactly as I say," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "You follow every order without question. You stay where I tell you, move when I tell you, breathe when I tell you." He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "Because if something happens to you, if the Petrovs get their hands on you again, they won't just use you against Marcus, they'll use you against me. And that makes you a weapon I can't afford to lose." Eve took the earpiece, her fingers brushing his. "That almost sounded like you care." "I care about strategic assets," Enzo corrected, but his eyes betrayed him, darkening with an intensity that had nothing to do with tactics. "Right," Eve said softly. "Strategic assets." Neither of them moved. The space between them crackled with possibility and danger and the weight of everything unspoken. Ares yawned, breaking the tension with canine practicality. 2 hours, Enzo repeated, his voice rough. Then we end this. Eve nodded, fitting the earpiece carefully. Then we end this. The Velvet Cage wasn't technically a nightclub, it was a front for money laundering, arms deals, and the kind of conversations that ended with bodies in the river. But it had excellent cocktails and a dress code that kept out the riffraff. Eve adjusted the black dress Enzo had procured from somewhere she didn't want to know about. It fit like sin, hugged curves she'd forgotten she had, and made her feel like someone else entirely. Someone dangerous. Stop fidgeting, Enzo murmured beside her. He'd transformed too. Gone was the tactical menace, replaced by European wealth in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her entire art collection. His hair was styled back, revealing the sharp angles of his face, and his usual intensity was masked behind lazy indifference. They looked like money, like power, like they belonged. "I've never been good at playing dress-up," Eve whispered as they approached the club's entrance, where 2 security mountains checked identification with the thoroughness of TSA agents. "You're an artist," Enzo said, his hand finding the small of her back warm, possessive, necessary for the cover. "Think of it as performance art. You're playing the role of my extremely expensive date." "How romantic." "Romance is for people who don't get shot at regularly." The security waved them through after a brief conversation in Russian and a discreet exchange of cash. Inside, the Velvet Cage lived up to its name. Opulent red velvet booths, crystal chandeliers that cast fractured light across beautiful, dangerous people, and music just loud enough to mask conversation. Eve's artist's eye catalogued everything. The exits, 3 visible, probably more hidden. The security cameras conspicuously absent in certain corners. The VIP section cordoned off by more muscle, the bar positioned to observe the entire space. "Second floor. Northwest corner," she murmured, her lips barely moving. "That's where the real business happens." 3 guards rotating in 15-minute intervals. Through the earpiece, Dante's voice crackled with approval. "The girl's observant. I like her." Enzo guided Eve to the bar, his hand never leaving her back. They ordered drinks, vodka martini for her, whiskey, neat for him, and played the role of wealthy couple surveying the entertainment. "There," Eve said quietly, tilting her head toward a booth where a man sat alone, scrolling through a tablet. Mid-40s, expensive suit, the kind of face that disappeared in crowds. "He's not drinking. Everyone else is either drunk or pretending to be. He's working." Enzo's eyes followed her line of sight. "Victor's accountant, Pavel Sokolov. If anyone knows where they're holding Marcus, it's him. So we ask nicely?" "Something like that." They moved through the crowd with practiced ease, Enzo's presence parting bodies like water. Pavel looked up as they approached, his expression shifting from annoyance to calculation. "Mr. Castelli," Pavel said in heavily accented English, "I thought Victor made it clear your family wasn't welcome in our establishments." "Victor says a lot of things," Enzo replied smoothly, sliding into the booth uninvited. Eve followed, playing her role as ornamental companion. "But business is business. And I hear you're the man who makes the numbers work." "I don't discuss business with competitors. Not even when the competitor has information about a certain tracking device planted in his protective custody?" Pavel's micro-expression, a flicker of surprise quickly masked, told Eve everything. He knew about the tracker, which meant he knew about the mole. "I don't know what you're talking about," Pavel said carefully. Eve leaned forward, channeling every ounce of bored sophistication she could muster. "The paintbrush charm. Military-grade tracker. Israeli manufacture." She examined her nails with affected disinterest. "We found it. We know about Marcus Smith. We know Victor plans to use him to dismantle the Castelli-Volkov agreement." She looked up, meeting Pavel's eyes with unexpected steel. "What we don't know is where you're keeping him. Yet." The accountant's jaw tightened. His hand moved subtly toward his jacket. Enzo's gun materialized faster than thought, pressed against Pavel's ribs beneath the table's edge. "Poor choice, friend." This is neutral territory, Pavel hissed. You can't? I just did. Enzo's smile was all teeth. Now, the witness's location. Quickly, before my patience runs out. Pavel's eyes darted around the club, looking for backup. That's when Eve noticed them, 3 men in tactical gear, trying to look casual, moving through the crowd with purpose. Toward their booth. Enzo, she warned, her voice tight. He saw them too. Time to go. Now. They moved as one, Enzo pulling Eve from the booth just as the first operative reached for his concealed weapon. The club erupted into controlled chaos, patrons scattering, security converging, the careful illusion of legitimacy shattering. Enzo's hand locked around Eve's wrist, pulling her through the crowd toward a service exit she'd spotted earlier. Behind them, shouts in Russian, the metallic click of weapons being readied. They burst through the exit into a narrow service corridor, industrial and claustrophobic. Enzo slammed the door, engaged an emergency lock that wouldn't hold long. Where's the car? Eve gasped, adrenaline singing through her veins. 2 blocks north. We need to. The door exploded inward. Enzo shoved Eve behind him, his body a shield, returning fire with brutal precision. 2 operatives dropped. A third appeared from a connecting corridor, cutting off their escape route. Victor's second in command, Dmitry Volkov. Built like a tank, with the dead eyes of someone who'd killed before breakfast. The girl, Dmitry said in thickly accented English, his weapon trained on Eve. Victor wants her alive. You, Castelli, he's less particular about. Enzo's calculation was instant angles, distances, probabilities. He couldn't get them both out. But he could get Eve out. Run, he commanded, not looking back at her. I'm not leaving. Run. Eve ran. The corridor was a maze of industrial nightmare pipes, locked doors, the smell of old grease and newer violence. Behind her, gunfire erupted, followed by the sounds of close combat. She burst through a fire exit into an alley, gasping for air. Enzo appeared 30 seconds later, blood on his knuckles, his suit torn. He grabbed her hand without slowing, pulling her into a desperate sprint. They reached the car, a nondescript sedan Luca had positioned, and threw themselves inside. Enzo's hands shook as he started the engine, his usual composure cracked and bleeding. The car peeled away from the curb as bullets sparked off the rear panel. They drove in silence for 3 blocks. 4, 5. Finally, Enzo pulled into a darkened parking structure, killing the engine in the deepest shadow. His breathing was ragged. Eve's matched it. They sat in darkness, alive against impossible odds, the adrenaline crash hitting them simultaneously. You were supposed to run, Enzo said, his voice raw. I did run, Eve countered. Right after you. He turned to face her, and in the shadows, his eyes were wild fear and fury, and something else entirely. You could have been killed. So could you. That's different. Why? Because you're the big bad mafia boss and I'm just... Enzo kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't practiced. It was desperate and chaotic, and tasted like fear and survival and everything they'd been fighting against. His hand cupped her face with unexpected tenderness, while his mouth claimed hers with absolute hunger. Eve's hands fisted in his torn jacket, pulling him closer, needing the reality of him solid, alive, here. The kiss deepened, months of tension shattering in seconds. When they finally broke apart, both gasping for air, Enzo's forehead pressed against hers. That, he started, his voice wrecked, was a one-time thing? Eve finished, her lips still tingling. A momentary lapse in judgment? Adrenaline-fueled mistake? Was inevitable, Enzo corrected quietly. And terrifying. Terrifying? You make me want things I can't have. Things that will get you killed. Eve's hand came up, tracing the line of his jaw. Little late for that concern, don't you think? He captured her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm that felt more intimate than the kiss they'd just shared. Then he released her. Pulling back, his walls reconstructing themselves brick by careful brick. That never happened, he said, starting the car, his voice rougher than gravel. Focus on the mission. Eve settled back in her seat, adjusting her ruined dress, feeling the ghost of his lips on hers. "Wouldn't dream of it, boss," she said, and let herself smile. Because they both knew she was lying, and he knew that she knew he was lying. And in the darkness of the parking structure, with violence behind them and more ahead, that shared lie felt more honest than any truth they could have spoken. The plan started falling apart at exactly 9:47 p.m. Luca's false signal had worked perfectly, too perfectly. The Petrovs had committed more resources than anticipated, turning what should have been a surgical extraction into a full-scale siege. Now Enzo and Eve were trapped on the 14th floor of the Meridian Tower, a half-renovated office building in the financial district, with Petrov operatives controlling every exit. "Dante," Enzo spoke quietly into his comm, "we need extraction, now." Static crackled back. "Pinned down 3 blocks, Ares is—" The connection died. Enzo's jaw tightened. Through the shattered window, Eve could see muzzle flashes from adjacent buildings. The Castells were engaged, but too far away to help. They were alone. "Rooftop," Enzo decided, already moving. He grabbed Eve's hand, pulling her through the skeletal office space, exposed beams, construction equipment, drop cloths fluttering like ghosts. Behind them, boots thundered up the stairwell. Russian voices coordinated the hunt. They burst onto the roof into cold night air. The city sprawled below them, beautiful and indifferent to their survival. Adjacent buildings created a maze of different heights, gaps varying from jumpable to suicidal. "There," Enzo pointed to a building 20 feet away, 1 story lower. "We jump, move across 3 more rooftops, reach the rendezvous point on Harmon Street." "That's a terrible plan." "It's the only plan." He was already backing up, measuring distance, calculating trajectory. On 3, 1, gunfire erupted from the stairwell door. Enzo returned fire without looking, his shots precise enough to force the operatives back into cover. 2, Eve's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd never been athletic, had spent her life in studios and galleries, not running across rooftops like some action hero. 3. They ran together, hitting the roof's edge in sync, launching into empty air. For one impossible moment, Eve was flying, wind rushing past, the city tilted at the wrong angle, gravity suspended in amber. Then she hit the adjacent roof, tucking and rolling like Enzo had shown her during their brief, contingency training session. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but she was alive, mobile, already scrambling to her feet. Enzo landed beside her with predatory grace. "Move!" They ran across tar paper and gravel, vaulting over HVAC units and satellite dishes. Behind them, the Petrov operatives were attempting the same jump, some making it, others not. Screams punctuated the night. The second gap was narrower. They cleared it easily. The third opened onto a rooftop garden, some architect's abandoned dream, now overgrown and wild. That's when Eve saw it. The laser sight, painting a dancing red dot across Enzo's chest. "Sniper!" she screamed, tackling him sideways just as the shot cracked through the air. The bullet sparked off a metal railing where Enzo's head had been. They scrambled behind a concrete planter box, breathing hard. The sniper was positioned on a water tower across the street, maybe 80 yards, elevated position, perfect line of sight. "Can't move without exposing ourselves," Enzo muttered, assessing angles. "And we can't stay here. The ground team will flank us in less than 2 minutes." Eve's mind raced, her artist's eye cataloging details. The copper water tower catching ambient light, the angle of the laser sight, the sniper's probable position based on shot trajectory. Then she saw it, the laser's reflection, bouncing off the tower's curved surface, revealing the sniper's exact location. An idea sparked, desperate and absurd. "You know," Eve said loudly, her voice carrying across the rooftop, "I always thought the Castelli operations were supposed to be impressive. But this—" She gestured dramatically at their shelter. "Hiding behind dead plants on a rooftop? Are those pigeons over there judging your jacket?" "Because I'm pretty sure they are." Enzo's head whipped toward her, confusion flickering across his features. Then, understanding, sharp, immediate, trusting. His eyes followed her meaningful glance toward the water tower, saw what she saw. "My jacket is Armani," he said, playing along while sliding his weapon into position. Pigeons wouldn't understand. Right, because birds are known for their terrible fashion sense. Now. Enzo rolled left, using her distraction to break cover. The sniper's laser tracked toward him, but Enzo was already firing one shot, two, three, aimed not at the sniper, but at the water tower's support strut. The metal screamed. The tower lurched. The sniper's position destabilized just enough. His shot went wide. Enzo's fourth bullet didn't miss. Silence fell across the rooftop, broken only by distant sirens and their ragged breathing. Enzo stared at Eve with an expression she couldn't quite parse: awe, terror, something that looked dangerously close to pride. "Pigeons judging my jacket?" he said finally. "It worked, didn't it? You're either brilliantly insane or insanely brilliant. I haven't decided which. Can't I be both?" A smile ghosted his lips, gone as quickly as it appeared. "We need to move. Ground team is already here," a voice called in, Russian accented English. 4 Petrov operatives emerged from the stairwell access, weapons raised. They'd been flanked while dealing with the sniper. Enzo's weapon was empty. Eve knew without asking she'd watched him count shots, had learned to read the tension in his shoulders when he was calculating impossible odds. The lead operative, young, cocky, eager to prove himself, stepped forward. "Mr. Castelli. Victor sends his regards. The girl comes with us. You get to choose. Easy death or hard death." "How about option 3? Eve said, her hand sliding into her jacket pocket. She pulled out the small device Luca had given her, supposedly a tracker jammer, but with a secondary function he'd mentioned offhandedly: concussive flashbang, one-time use, close range only. "Eve, don't," Enzo started. She triggered it. The rooftop exploded in light and sound. Even with her eyes closed and ears covered, the concussive force knocked Eve backward. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Enzo moving, disarming, incapacitating, ending threats with brutal efficiency. When her vision cleared, all 4 operatives were unconscious or worse. Enzo stood over them, breathing hard, looking at her with an intensity that made her chest ache. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "Again. Who's counting?" "I am." He crossed to her in 3 strides, cupping her face with hands that shook barely, but enough. "You weren't supposed to be part of this. You were supposed to be a civilian I was protecting. But you keep—" He stopped, searching for words. "You keep being more." Eve's hand covered his, still pressed against her cheek. "Maybe that's who I've always been. I just needed a reason to stop hiding." The moment stretched between them, heavy with everything unspoken. Enzo's comm crackled to life. "Boss, we've cleared at the rendezvous. Ares is going crazy." "On our way," Enzo responded, his voice steady despite the chaos. He pulled a phone from one of the unconscious operatives, scrolling quickly. His expression shifted satisfaction, grim and sharp. Pavel's files, locations, schedules, security protocols. His dark eyes found Eve's, including where they're holding Marcus. Relief and fear warred in Eve's chest. "Where?" "Industrial complex on the waterfront. 12 guards, rotating shifts, underground holding cells." He pocketed the phone. "We can reach him. But we need to move now, before they realize we have the information." They ran across 2 more rooftops, making the final jump onto the fire escape of a building that connected to Harmon Street. 3 stories down, Enzo's car idled at the curb, Marco at the wheel. And beside the car, pacing with barely contained energy, was Ares. The pit bull saw them and released a bark that sounded like a war cry. When Eve finally reached the ground, her legs shaking from exertion and adrenaline, Ares planted himself between her and the world, his solid presence, grounding and protective. Enzo watched his dog with visible confusion. "He's never done this with anyone." "Maybe he knows I'm the one keeping you alive," Eve said, running her fingers through Ares's fur. "Maybe," Enzo agreed quietly, his eyes holding hers across the space of a few feet that felt like miles. He's smarter than both of us. They loaded into the car. Enzo, Eve, Aries filling the back seat, Marco driving with the focused silence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "The waterfront?" Enzo commanded. "And Marco, drive fast." As the city blurred past, Eve's hand found Enzo's in the darkness between them, his fingers interlaced with hers, collused, warm, steady, despite everything. They were going to get her brother back, or die trying. Either way, Eve realized, she was done being the civilian watching from the sidelines. She was done hiding. The waterfront operation took 17 minutes. 17 minutes of coordinated chaos, Dante's team breaching from the north, Luca disabling security systems, Marco and Alessio providing cover fire that sounded like thunder across the industrial complex. Enzo moved through it all like a dark angel of retribution, Eve shadowing him with a borrowed weapon she hoped she wouldn't have to use. They found Marcus in the third underground cell, bruised but alive, his eyes widening in shock when he saw his sister. "Eve? What the hell are you?" "Saving your stupid heroic ass," Eve interrupted, cutting his zip ties with a knife that felt foreign in her hands. Explanations later. Running now. The extraction was textbook perfect. By the time Petrov reinforcements arrived, the Castellis were ghosts, leaving only bodies and burning evidence behind. Now, 3 hours later, Marcus sat in the medical wing of the Castelli compound, a fortress disguised as a luxury estate on the city's outskirts, being treated by a doctor who asked no questions and recorded no names. Eve stood in the hallway outside, blood on her borrowed tactical gear, exhaustion pulling at her bones. She'd done it. They'd done it. Marcus was safe. So why did she feel like the hardest part was still coming? "He'll be fine," Dante said, appearing beside her with the silent efficiency of someone trained in stealth. "Dehydrated, some bruising, but nothing permanent." "You got him out in time." "We got him out," Eve corrected. "No," Dante's smile was knowing. "You got him out. You saved Enzo on that rooftop. You provided the intelligence that made this rescue possible. You—" He paused, studying her with the assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading people. "You changed everything, Miss Smith." Before Eve could respond, Enzo's voice cut through the hallway. "Dante, give us the room." The consigliere nodded once and disappeared, leaving Eve alone with the man who'd become impossible to categorize: protector, partner, something far more dangerous than either. Enzo looked like war personified. His tactical gear was torn, blood splattered across his chest, none of it his, she'd checked obsessively. His dark hair was wild, his eyes burning with an intensity that made her breath catch. "We need to talk," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something else. "About what?" "The mission was successful. Marcus is safe. The Petrovs lost their leverage." Eve crossed her arms, suddenly defensive. "Isn't that what you wanted?" "What I wanted," Enzo said slowly, moving closer, "was to keep you safe. To protect you from exactly this kind of violence. Instead, you threw yourself into the center of it. I saved your life." "I know." The words exploded from him, raw and unfiltered. "You saved my life on that rooftop. You saved yourself in that alley. You've been saving everyone around you since the moment you signaled my dog." He stopped 3 feet away, his hands clenched at his sides. "And it's terrifying." Eve's anger faltered. "Why?" "Because I can't protect someone who refuses to stay protected. Because you're not supposed to be part of this world. Because—" He stopped, struggling with words that clearly didn't come easily. "Because you make me want things that will get you killed." "Like what?" "Like this." He closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with unexpected gentleness. "Like having you beside me. Not behind me. Like trusting someone other than a dog for the first time in 8 years. Like imagining a future that doesn't end in violence." Eve's heart hammered against her ribs. "Enzo, I'm not done." His thumbs traced her cheekbones, his touch reverent despite the blood staining his hands. "You changed the rules." "Eve Smith." You were supposed to be a civilian I was protecting, a strategic asset, collateral damage I was minimizing. His dark eyes held hers, vulnerable in a way that stole her breath. But you became something else. Something I didn't plan for and can't control. What? Eve whispered, barely daring to hope. Everything. The word hung between them, heavy with implication and promise and fear. Eve's hands came up, covering his where they still cradled her face. I'm not leaving. I'm not hiding. I'm not going to be shipped off to some safe house in another country while you fight this war alone. Eve. I'm not finished either, she interrupted, channeling every ounce of defiance she possessed. You said I make you want impossible things? Well, you made me brave. You made me realize I'd been hiding in art studios my whole life, afraid of confrontation, afraid of being seen. But I'm done hiding. She stepped closer, until their bodies were almost touching. I want to be part of this. Not as someone you protect, but as someone who stands beside you. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking. I've seen your world, Enzo. I've run through it, bled in it, survived it. And I'm still here, still choosing this. Her voice softened. Still choosing you. Enzo stared at her with an expression that looked like awe and terror in equal measure. For a long moment, he said nothing, just searched her face for doubts he wouldn't find. Finally, his hands dropped from her face, but only to take her hands in his, linking them together with deliberate intention. The Petrovs want war, he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decision and acceptance. They kidnapped the wrong woman. They threatened the wrong family. They picked the wrong queen to capture. His grip tightened, his eyes burning with fierce possessiveness. You are under the protection of the Castelli family now, not as a civilian, not as leverage, but as one of us, as mine. Yours? Eve's lips curved into a smile that felt like sunrise. Mine, Enzo confirmed, pulling her closer. If you're brave enough to want that. I signaled your dog in broad daylight while being kidnapped. I jumped across buildings and distracted snipers with jokes about pigeons. I think we've established I'm either very brave or completely insane. Both, Enzo said, and kissed her. This kiss was different from the desperate collision in the car. This was a promise deliberate, deep, claiming. His hands slid into her hair, angling her head to deepen the kiss, and Eve melted into him, finally allowing herself to feel everything she'd been holding back. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Enzo rested his forehead against hers. This won't be easy, he warned. The Petrovs won't stop. There will be more danger, more violence, more nights like tonight. Good thing I'm not looking for easy, Eve replied, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. I'm looking for real. A throat cleared behind them. They turned to find Marcus standing in the medical wing doorway, supported by Dante, looking confused and protective and slightly murderous. Someone want to explain, Marcus said slowly. Why my sister is kissing the Mafia boss who's been keeping me locked up for 3 months. Eve and Enzo exchanged glances. It's complicated, they said in unison. Marcus looked at Dante. Is this complicated good or complicated bad? Honestly? Dante smiled. It's complicated interesting, which in our world is the best you can hope for. The next hour was a whirlwind of explanations, recriminations, and reluctant acceptance. Marcus wasn't thrilled about his sister's new alliance, but he was alive to complain about it, which Eve considered a win. Luca reported that the tracker network had been completely dismantled. The Petrov mole, a junior security officer seduced by money and threats, had been identified and neutralized. The immediate danger had passed. But as Enzo had warned, the larger war was just beginning. Late that night, Eve found herself on a balcony overlooking the Castelli compound's grounds, Ares pressed against her leg in companionable silence. The city glittered in the distance, beautiful and treacherous. Enzo emerged from the shadows, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He offered her one, then stood beside her, their shoulders touching. No regrets? He asked quietly. Eve thought about her quiet life, the galleries, the cafes, the safe invisibility. Then she thought about rooftops and car chases, and the feeling of standing beside someone who saw all of her and didn't flinch. "Not one," she said. Enzo's arm came around her waist, pulling her close. She leaned into him, exhausted but triumphant, alive in ways she'd never been. "The Petrovs will respond," Enzo murmured against her hair. "This isn't over." "I know. It's going to get worse before it gets better." "I know that too." "And you're still staying?" Eve turned in his arms, meeting his dark eyes without hesitation. "I'm still staying." He kissed her again, softer this time, tender despite the violence that surrounded them. And somewhere in the compound below, preparations were already beginning for the war that was coming. But for this moment, this breath, they had each other. And that was enough. Dawn broke over the city like a wound, red and angry, bleeding light across steel and glass. Eve woke in Enzo's bed, wrapped in sheets that smelled like expensive cologne and gunpowder, the events of the previous night feeling both surreal and undeniable. Enzo wasn't beside her. She found him in the main room of his penthouse suite, standing before a wall of monitors displaying news feeds from every major network. He wore only black pants, his tattooed torso a map of violence survived, his spine rigid with tension. Something was wrong. "Enzo?" Eve moved closer, Ares padding beside her, sensing the shift in atmosphere. He didn't turn, just gestured toward the screens with a glass of whiskey that suggested he'd never gone to sleep. Every channel showed the same thing. Aerial footage of the waterfront complex, the burned-out remains of the Velvet Cage, police barricades blocking off 3 separate crime scenes across the financial district. The chyron scrolling across the bottom read, "Gang war erupts in city center, multiple casualties, authorities investigating." "It's started," Enzo said quietly, his voice stripped of emotion. "The Petrovs are making their move." Before Eve could respond, every screen simultaneously cut to breaking news. A press conference, hastily arranged, with the kind of production value that screamed desperation disguised as authority. Viktor Petrov stood before a wall of microphones, his silver hair perfectly styled, his suit immaculate. He looked like a concerned citizen, not the monster who'd orchestrated her kidnapping. "Ladies and gentlemen," Viktor began in accented English, his voice carrying practiced gravitas. "For too long, this city has suffered under the iron grip of organized crime. The Castelli family has operated with impunity, bringing violence to our streets, corrupting our institutions, destroying innocent lives." "Bastard," Eve breathed. "Shh," Enzo commanded, his eyes never leaving the screen. "Last night," Viktor continued, "the Castellis escalated their campaign of terror. They attacked legitimate business operations, murdered security personnel, and kidnapped witnesses under police protection, all to protect their criminal empire." He paused, letting the lies settle. "I am calling for an emergency summit of all the city's major families, a meeting to restore order, to establish peace, to end the Castelli reign of terror once and for all." The screen split Viktor on one side, file photos of Enzo on the other. They'd chosen the worst ones. Enzo looking dangerous, cold, every inch the ruthless crime lord the media loved to demonize. "Enzo Castelli," Viktor addressed the camera directly. "You have 48 hours to agree to the summit. If you refuse, the families will unite against you. If you accept, we will discuss terms for your peaceful retirement from city operations." His smile was a shark's. "The choice is yours. But make no mistake, your era is over." The feed cut back to newsroom anchors debating the implications, but Eve had stopped listening. She was watching Enzo, watching the way his jaw tightened, the way his knuckles whitened around the glass. "It's a trap," she said unnecessarily. "Of course it's a trap." Enzo finally turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw something she'd never seen before, not fear, but calculation on a scale that made her breath catch. "Viktor knows he can't beat me in a straight fight, so he's changing the game, making this public, forcing me to either accept his terms or look weak to every other family in the city. So what do we do?" We? Enzo's lips quirked despite the circumstances. When did this become we? Around the time I jumped across rooftops and saved your life. We've been over this. He crossed to her in 3 strides, cupping her face with hands that still carried the faint scent of cordite. If I accept this summit, if I walk into that room, there's a significant chance I don't walk out. The Petrovs will have every angle covered, every contingency planned. Then we plan better, Eve said simply. You have Dante, Luca, Marco, Alessio, the best strategic minds in the city. You have resources, loyalty, intelligence, the Petrovs can't match. And I have you. It wasn't a question. You have me, Eve confirmed, her hand covering his. Whether you want me or not. I want you, Enzo said quietly, intensely. That's the problem. Because wanting you means protecting you, and I can't protect you if I'm walking into a trap designed to end me. Eve's smile was fierce. Good thing I don't need protecting anymore. I need a partner, someone who trusts me to stand beside him, not behind him. Enzo stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, acceptance, resignation, pride, fear, love, all warring for dominance. His phone buzzed. Dante's name flashed across the screen. Enzo answered, putting it on speaker. Tell me, every family in the city is watching? Dante's voice came through, tight with tension. The Petrovs just forced your hand publicly. If you refuse the summit, you look weak. If you accept, you're walking into an execution. I know. So, what do we do? Enzo's eyes never left Eve's face. We give them what they want. We accept the summit. We walk into their trap. Silence on the line. Then, boss. But we don't walk in as victims. Enzo continued, his voice hardening into command. We walk in as conquerors. The Petrovs have given me a gift, Dante. A reason to stop operating in shadows. A reason to burn everything down and rebuild it properly. Eve heard the shift from defense to offense, from survival to domination. Prepare the men, Enzo commanded, his voice cold as winter. Full tactical deployment, intelligence on every family attending the summit, contingencies for every possible scenario. And Dante? Find me everything on Viktor Petrov, every dirty secret, every buried body, every compromising photograph. If he wants war, we'll give him war. But it will be fought on my terms. Understood. And boss? The girl. Eve, Enzo corrected, his hand finding hers, linking their fingers together. Her name is Eve, and she's not going anywhere. He ended the call. For a moment, they stood in silence, the weight of the decision settling around them like armor. Then Enzo moved toward the balcony, the floor-to-ceiling windows sliding open to admit morning air tinged with city exhaust and possibility. He stepped out onto the balcony that overlooked his empire, the sprawling city that had made him, and tried to break him in equal measure. Eve followed without hesitation, Ares padding after them, the faithful pit bull whose instinct had started this entire cascade of violence and love. The city stretched before them, millions of lives, thousands of secrets, hundreds of battles fought in shadows and boardrooms and blood-stained alleys. Somewhere down there, Viktor Petrov was celebrating his strategic brilliance, certain he'd cornered the infamous Enzo Castelli. He had no idea what was coming. Eve stepped to Enzo's side, her hand finding his arm, her touch grounding and electric. She wore his shirt, her hair wild, her feet bare, looking nothing like a mafia queen and everything like a force of nature. You know this changes everything, Enzo said quietly, his eyes on the distant skyline. The summit, the families, the exposure, there's no going back to a quiet life after this. Good, Eve replied, her voice steady. I was never very good at quiet anyway. Enzo turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw everything, the danger ahead, the violence that would come, the impossibility of their situation. But she also saw acceptance, trust, and something that looked dangerously like hope. The Petrovs want war, he said, his voice carrying across the balcony like a declaration. They just picked the wrong queen to capture. Eve smiled, fierce and unafraid. So let's show them what happens when you back a queen into a corner. Enzo pulled her close, his arm around her waist, his lips brushing her temple. Below them, the city pulsed with morning traffic, oblivious to the storm gathering in the penthouse above. Ares sat at their feet, vigilant and loyal. The dog who'd seen something in Eve that even she hadn't recognized, strength wrapped in artists' hands, courage disguised as creativity, a survivor who'd been waiting for a reason to stop hiding. Together? Enzo asked, the word carrying weight beyond simple confirmation. Eve looked up at him, this dangerous, complicated man who'd become her unexpected salvation and damnation in equal measure. Together, she confirmed. And as the sun climbed higher over the city, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow, Enzo Castelli and Eve Smith stood side by side, two people who'd found each other in the chaos of kidnapping and violence, who'd built something real from desperation and trust. The war was coming. The summit would be a bloodbath. The city would shake with what was about to unfold. But they would face it together, the mafia boss, the artist, and the loyal dog whose instinct had rewritten all their fates. Ready to burn everything down and rebuild it in their image. Ready to show Viktor Petrov and every other family in the city what happened when you underestimated a woman who signaled a dog instead of a man. Ready to rule. The end. Or, perhaps, just the beginning.